Thanks everybody for being here. I'm personally extremely passionate about this conversation. I'm curious to hear what everybody's kind of like attachment to religion is, what types of religion, what their upbringing was versus what they, where they stand now. Just know this is like a really safe space. This is also a really respectful space. So if you still, consider yourself religious, this isn't trying to bash any religion. It's also not trying to convert anyone into your beliefs. It's more so just a conversation to talk about any harms that might be done to the LGBT community from these institutions and how we can see ourselves make positive change for our community. I'm curious to hear what people's religious backgrounds are and what you know most about.
I'm Christian and pagan, and I'm also an ex-pastor.
Very cool. Welcome.
Thanks.
I'm Saren. I grew up PCUSA Presbyterian. It's a more left-wing Christian faith, whatever. But now I call myself Celtic pagan.
I'm Rakita. Pronouns are they, them. I'm raised, I guess, like Baptist. I don't think I had like super strong ties in the church, but there's still trauma there. Now I am religiously fluid, if I had to describe myself as anything.
I'm Bobbie Glass, and I'm openly transgender too. That's very important because long time ago, I got married into a family that was just hardcore Church of Christ, Nashville, Tennessee, and really didn't understand what I was getting into, but I had always been open about my trans identity. They probably had me in conversion therapy for about 20 years. One of my favorite groups is the Free Thinker Society, which is predominantly atheist, and I really love them.
My name is Roggio. I'm the director of 1946, the Mistranslation That Shifted Culture. You can watch the movie now, support independent film on our website, 1946themovie.com. But the movie tells a little bit about my background. I grew up in the church. I'm a preacher's kid. So many people are doing such important work around this issue with religious trauma and institutions that are gatekeeping and or treating people as other. And I'll end with this. I'm watching a film right now. I'm on a jury for a film festival, and there's a film in Brazil about a transgender woman. They call themselves transsexual, and they're fighting to be in the evangelical church after being physically assaulted by the pastor and calling out these institutions for crimes against humanity, in the sense where if they are putting things in the public's mind like we are demons, they are inciting violence against us, then that turns into a crime. And so it's a really powerful film. I'm so excited to be a part of that and more of these kinds of conversations.
Brazil just is the murder capital of the world for transgender women. I mean, they're killed all over the world, but the bulk of them are in Brazil. It's very hostile.
This is a great conversation because I think some of the things that are coming up that folks are sharing are fears that I had, that probably fears that a lot of people had growing up. I didn't grow up religious. I grew up spiritual. And it's a spiritual path that's kind of based off of Sikhism, which is a part of northern India. And I think for so much of my life, I felt that disconnect between who I knew myself to be and my spiritual path because of all of it. I mean, it's so much of it sometimes is like, is there a disconnect between what God intends and who we are? And I think I battled with that for a long time. And then kind of coming to terms with that, I realized that transition and being trans was a part of my spiritual journey. And it's become something that I feel I'm the most grateful for in my life.
It's beautiful.
I also read God is a Black Woman by Christina Cleveland. But Black and Buddhist was written from the perspective of queer Black women who practice Buddhism. And both of them hand in hand are reframing our queerness as part of our divinity and not separating the two. So I just wanted to highlight that. So I do think that that is part of our divine and spiritual walk.
Thank you.
I love that thought. And I feel like that has a lot of power behind it. I hear a lot of Christians say, like, you were born a certain way, God doesn't make mistakes. And that's such an easy way to take that sentiment and be like, you're right, God doesn't make mistakes. In Shaan's experience that he just shared, right? Like, he was born to transition. We were born to be queer. It's not a mistake.
I think it was wonderful to learn for myself that I have more layers than I ever thought I did. You know, and speaking of this, connected with spirituality, that was a big like shot in the gut in a good way for me.
And I think too, like, one of the most basic things that I learned in Christianity was we are made in God's image. God is a creator, so we are also creators. We create ourselves. And I think that that's something I didn't really come to mind with until the past couple of years when I did begin transitioning, but
Was a speaker was talking about eunuchs in the Bible, and it's like uh, this. It has always been there. It is hidden in plain sight, and you know, you've got all these religious people that I can pretty much guess what kind of grade they got in grammar because they said, "Oh, the Bible says you're either male or female." No, it doesn't. It says male and female, and they've turned that into a rigid binary. And so when I'm talking to religious people, I often identify myself as a unit because I'm both and neither male nor female. And and the reason I do that is because I want them to go back home and do a word search on eunuchs. And they're in the Bible 80 times. But like, for instance, in the book of Esther, she became queen because the eunuchs took her under their wing and they just made her more gorgeous and gorgeous and gorgeous. The word eunuch appears in the book of Esther, but then their names are given. And so when I say it's in there 80 times, it's it's either the word eunuch or the names of the eunuchs are in there. And they go all the way from the book of Genesis to the book of Acts and Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. And it's like these people who, and Jesus in Matthew 19, 11, 12, he says, some people are born eunuchs. And it's like, here you've got somebody that claims to be there at creation, said, yeah, we did that on purpose. We know what we're doing. And how people can be so hateful to want to eradicate us and everything. And so I spend a lot of time talking about eunuchs and that idea that, no, you are wrong. You know, it's God says, like, man in our image, male and female. When Adam was created, Adam was male and female. Nobody talks about that. Every fetus begins as a female embryo. And nothing about X or Y chromosomes or SRY genes even comes into play until like the 6th to 8th week of gestation. And that is exactly why men have nipples and they have that little rapey line that runs from their anus up their scrotum to the tip of their penis, because that's where a vaginal canal is starting to form. And so how people can be so rigid that in all of the 100 billion people who've lived on this planet, there was never room for any kind of diversity and wiring. It's like, no, really. Pull up your shirt, look down your nipples, guys. It's like, yeah, diversity and the human condition, yeah, being intersex and all that stuff is part of the human condition. Please stop hating us because you're really just showing your ignorance when you do that. But it's a hard sell. People don't want to believe that. They really don't.
I'm going to just piggyback off this, if you don't mind. First of all, thank you for mentioning intersex, because that's actually a really good, I think, conversation to have with somebody who might be having a hard time with this conversation. There's a trans author called Austin Harkey, an LGBT Christian, and he wrote a book and is a Old Testament scholar. And he goes into the first of all, defining the platypus, because they're neither male nor female. You know, that was an interesting perspective. But in this binary, it's male and female. When you look at the book of Genesis, it's night and day, earth and land. and all of these things that are that, talk about the two polars, day and night, and even God is the Alpha and the Omega, but there's always something in between. So with day and night, you've got dusk and dawn. With sea and land, you have marsh. Things have been manipulated in a way for us to see one way. And then another thing with what we did with our film and looking at Bible translations, if you're reading a Bible that is constructed with that point of view, like the ESV or the NIV, it's going to say men, where other Bibles will say all people or all humans and things like that, and have inclusive language.
Yeah, bouncing off of what's been said from what Bobbie was saying a little earlier too, recently I heard a lot of people have been saying that Jesus was a trans man because he didn't have XY chromosomes, because there
That's
was
right.
that's like such an interesting take.
Yeah, if you believe in the Immaculate Conception, there is no way he could have had a Y chromosome. Yeah.
That's so interesting.
I mean, and you have got to do all kinds of mental gymnastics to justify in your mind how, but Jesus doesn't have a Y chromosome. It's like to accept it. The other thing, Rocky, I wanted to be sure to mention the Talmud. The Talmud originated with Moses, and everybody knows he brings down the stone tablets, the written law. But the Talmud was for the training of the priesthood of rabbis, and the Talmud has 8 genders in it. It's got procreating male and female. That's 2. But there were 2 types of masculine females and 2 types of effeminate men and 2 types of asexuals. And that is just the way it was. Rabbis, when you go out to your communities, you can expect to have people of 8 genders. And Jesus was a rabbi. And there is not one word of condemnation against gender identity or sexual orientation ever hinted from Jesus's mouth. And one of the things I've been really trying to dig into is what happened to the 8 genders of the Talmud. That was just a way of the world. That was common knowledge. It was totally accepted. But something has happened where people have taken all of that away and don't want us to know about that. And what I've come to the conclusion is, my theory is that it has to do with the dawn of the industrial age and colonization. And most people don't know that King James, the very same King James that did the Bible, was also the major stakeholder in the Virginia Company. Life expectancy was exceedingly short for colonists back then. They, like 80% of the initial colonists of Jamestown died that first year. And so it's like you had to have procreating people. If you were going to colonize India or the Congo or North America or South America, you wanted to send procreating people to do that because you had to establish a beachhead with a growing population. And I just can't find the answer to that. What happened to the 8 genders of the Talmud? And I think monarchs had been very busy trying to erase that because colonization created immense, enormous, incomprehensible wealth for royal families. And they had to have procreating colonists to do that. So anyhow, that's just a question I'm having a really hard time answering. So anybody that might get interested in this, I need some help.
There's a really good book I'm still reading because it's very well informed. It might have indirect information for you. It's called Religion and the Decline of Magic.
Oh, interesting.
It's by an Oxford Don, so he does his stuff,
I don't know if this is more apocryphal or if it's actually got basis in truth, but I remember reading somewhere that one of the reasons why King James commissioned the King James version of the Bible was to draw attention away from the fact that he was having affairs with younger men. Yeah.
Why?
So I mean, there's a lot of I think that from the time of Jesus to whatever we've got today that we call Christianity, that it's been like a really terrible game of telephone. And a lot of things have been manipulated over the years, especially when there was a gap between learned people and people who couldn't read, couldn't write, didn't get schooling or whatever. There was a time when, you know, you just did what your priest or what your Lord told you to do, and they could make up anything.
Yeah.
And there are books that have been removed from the Bible that were considered, you know, not actual books of the Bible. But then you get into things like, I don't know, you get New Testament, you get Paul's letters, and you're like, wait a minute, is this God talking, or is this just some dude who's giving his opinion at this point?
Right, exactly.
So, and then as
And
far
what
as
Paul says is more important than what Jesus says to a whole lot of people.
for a whole lot of people, they would rather quote Paul than quote the actual, you know, red letter text of Jesus. Which is, you know, telling, I think. But, you know, you guys were talking about, you know, intersex and the 8 genders and all of that. And that reminded me, a friend of mine who is on testosterone said that apparently now that they're on testosterone, eventually they're going to have to get a prostate check because testosterone actually starts growing prostate tissue in your body. If you're you know, assigned female at birth, obviously we don't have prostates, but apparently that tissue can start growing in your body with the testosterone. So I thought that was really why I think that kind of goes to, not to get too sciencey here, but we really don't know even half of what's going on with the human body. We really, really don't. And how hormones affect things and change what our bodies do and all that. And, you know, people are like, oh, this is unnatural. Well, maybe this is actually the way it was intended to be, you know, that you could take more of this hormone or that hormone and literally change who you are. There are species in on the planet that they can change their gender to whatever their colony needs or their little, you know, group needs, especially like fish and stuff, can change from male to female depending on what is needed for the group. Why can't we?
It's interesting that you say that, actually. Yeah, there's stories about, in Hinduism. I didn't grow up specifically with Hinduism, but I looked at this last year. There are, you know, stories about gods and goddesses and, you know, kings and queens. And there was a story in one of the mythologies about one of the god figures who was named Shikhandi, who was born assigned female at birth and was the daughter of a king who had to go into war and made a deal with another deity to change their sex and became a male. And interestingly, and I think the story goes that when the king had this child, like a seer or a prophet told the king that your child's journey is going to be from female to male. Like, it was already in the prophecy of their life. And I found it so interesting that it was part of the story. And I think there are a lot of stories like that, and it's really interesting to kind of dig into our cultures and our spiritual teachings and find these stories, because they are there. They're just not super visible to us.
A good one is Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. You all know that musical, right? It's a real Bible story, I'm sure you know. And Joseph was, I think, the youngest of 12 or something brothers. And this robe that was gifted to him from his father is only mentioned one other time in the Hebrew Bible. And I think it's a princess's garment, basically. So it's a feminine piece of clothing. So either he was trans or effeminate, which is considered a sin. And it's the same kind of concepts that are going on with the 1946, which is what is happening is there's an active participant and a passive participant. And the one thing you don't want to do or be as a male is feminized or be treated like a woman, you know, and we still do these things today. You're a sissy, you're a pussy, you're a pansy, you're a coward, you know, and that's actually what the malakoi means, soft or like a coward. And so, you know, are these derogatory terms? And I just find it interesting that the dream code is only mentioned twice, and it's a feminine garment. And he was beaten up by his brothers, outcast by his brothers, potentially for being LGBTQ. That's just my theory.
Well, that's not a bad theory because people don't talk about it, but both Daniel and Joseph most certainly had to become eunuchs, especially Joseph, because he had already been accused of assaulting, a wife, and he just could not have moved through the palace with the type of access he had unless he'd been castrated. Same with Daniel, and people don't realize that those high officials that had easy access to the harem and everything else, because uh, the most important thing was keeping that bloodline pure and keeping it from contaminated. And you didn't want to let anybody near those women that could do that. And so, uh, yeah, and Daniel and Joseph would have had to agree to that probably to keep advancing in their authority. So that was one of the things that really opened my eyes, because I had always been told what the Bible said. And the people that were teaching me were always heterosexual, and they were talking about how to have a pure marriage, how to have pure dating relationships, how to be a good father, be a good mother. And all they ever looked at were those kinds of passages. And it wasn't until I decided for myself to really dig in deep to gender that I realized, oh my gosh, it's been hidden in plain sight forever. And why we never talk about that is a mystery to me. And I've just got to believe that it has to do with entrenching a male patriarchy. And I think that's why Paul is has so much more authority in church matters than Jesus does. When you start quoting things like the Beatitudes, people say, "Oh, that's just liberal libtard stuff." No, we can't do that anymore. And oh gosh, it's really sad.
We are being fed this idea of the patriarchy, and a lot of Native communities, Native cultures, before, Christianity took over, it was designed around a matriarchy and
Mhm.
raising babies as a community and, providing resources for the children of the community and all of this. And with patriarchy comes capitalism. If each
Mhm.
individual family has to own a vacuum and, all these, that was a random example,
Right.
but if each
No.
individual home has to own and buy these separate things and provide for themselves, and instead of putting their resources into the whole, it's keeping it, hoarding it for yourself. It's,
Mhm.
yeah, it's designed for patriarchal, capitalistic, white supremacy, honestly.
Exactly. I'm so glad you said that.
Rocky, you mentioned a word earlier, and I'd like you to elaborate on that because I don't think most of the people here have seen 1946. So you said the malakoi. Can you
Yeah,
explain what
so
that is?
sure. So the film 1946 examines a passage in the New Testament written by Paul that we've mentioned earlier. And it's 1 Corinthians 6:9-10. And it is the first time in history where any Bible translation uses the word homosexual. And what had happened is the translation committee took two Greek words, malakoi and arsenokoitai, and saw that there was some sort of sex act going on here, and most likely amongst males. And so we get into what kind of sex is going on, why we can say for sure it's not a homosexual, and we look at why we know it's not that and what it could possibly be. And then from there, we see how the word homosexual spread into multiple translations in the 70s and 80s, and then became weaponized against the LGBTQ community. And the church had it in black and white that the homosexuals are the dirty, filthy ones in society, and we need to get rid of them. Made it very easy for them to politicize our community. Now, a lot of the pushback that we would get is obviously homophobia has existed before 1946, and homosexuals have always been, and now obviously we say LGBTQIA plus, have always been persecuted, and that is true. And that's what we look at as well. And what I mentioned earlier with the malakoi being a soft coward and being feminized, being treated like a woman, and this male dominant arsenokoitai that is doing the penetrating, and you either are the penetrator or you're the penetrated. And so we get into sex is something in the ancient world that you used to do to somebody, not with somebody. which is why we know if you can just break down a homosexual is a person, or a queer person, an LGBTQ person is an identity, and and what we're talking about in the Bible is an act that has a consequence, that has a victim on the other side. It's most likely representing some sort of either pederasty, which is not necessarily sex with minors. They didn't see it that way. They wouldn't call it pedophilia. They would call it, it's just what they would do to get out to this thing that men do. And if you were a prominent man in society, the arsenokoitai, you could do that to essentially any other lower class person, whether it's a child, an enslaved person, or a boy. A woman is a prostitute woman, most likely. And the reason why they would do this abuse to the boys is because, and whether or not it was consensual sex for money, most of the time it was not. It was definitely an act done to somebody else. And so, you know, the notes are there to see that this is an abusive situation and not a group of people.
Well, you're right that
Intimate
the
relationship.
penetration part was a way of asserting your ownership over a woman. You know, it's like, who penetrated you? That's the person that owns you, you know.
Yeah, and so that's what I was about to say. The reason why they would do this abuse to the young boys is they didn't want to spoil the women, because the women had to be virgins to be married off. And then they usually were married off by age 12 or 13, so they were already property. So they would do this abuse to young boys, prepubescent, and then as soon as they hit puberty, they would be discarded. And it was very common in the ancient world. Now, to be honest to the text, so when it was first translated in 1946, the malakoi and the arsenokoitai combined, the footnote says that 2 Greek words were rendered to form this expression. The Revised Standard Version Updated Edition and the New Revised Standard Updated Edition have now since corrected this mistake, realizing that it's not a homosexual, and understanding that it's 2 separate things going on here. And they went from first sodomite to male prostitute, which a catamite would be in there, which is a slave for sex. And now they say illicit sex amongst men. And it's still some sort of sex act, but it's not a homosexual. And in the footnote, it says the Greek is uncertain here. And if the ancient writers, and Paul specifically, wanted to write about same gender love, there were words for men that fancied each other in the time. He didn't use any of those words. He made up a word that clearly was derived from the Levitical passages, Leviticus 18:22, where in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, which is what Paul would have been using because he was a Greek speaker, said arsen and koitai, for man shall not lie with male as he does with a female. And so we believe whatever sex act is going on and being poo-pooed upon in Leviticus is similar to what's going on here. And it is still has those notes of power, dominance, sex over someone, treating somebody like a woman and turning them into property. And you don't want to do that to a male, because then they're not worthy in society. That's when they become soft, and that's when they become not a man anymore, and they're useless in that culture. So that's kind of what's going on there. Now, one other thing I'll say, if you look at Leviticus 20:13, in that passage, they give both participants, the active and the passive, the death penalty. And even in 1 Corinthians 6:9, both the active and the passive participant are punished. And one of the top questions we get is why, if they're the victim, why are they being punished too? And if you look at the Levitical passages in 20:13, right after it says, man shall not lie with male as he does with a female, for it's an abomination, both shall be put to death. The very next passage says, man shall not lie with animal as he does with a female, for it is an abomination, both shall be put to death. It's the same exact language, it's the same exact usage, and we know the animal is not consenting to this act. So it was about purging the land from this impurity. And we see this today, even in cultures with victim shaming. If you get raped, you know, you're usually getting shamed or not believed. And that's where the whole Me Too movement came in. And then in other cultures, unfortunately, we see women who will actually be killed by their family if they've been shamed in that way. And so it's not far-fetched to say that's what was most likely going on in the ancient world when you're looking at it with a clear, honest lens and not a men need to lead and this is our agenda to make this say this. Does that make sense?
The centurion that came
Yes.
to Jesus and said to heal my servant. Now, there are a lot of scholars that say, heal my catamite.
Correct.
And so here you have this high-ranking Roman official pleading with Jesus to come heal his sexual slave. And Jesus
Yep.
doesn't hesitate. Come on, let's go. And the guy, oh no, please, I'm not
And he
worthy
was
to have
using
you
love.
come
He
into my.
loved him. You know,
Yeah,
he loved this boy that was his sex slave, essentially. And
yeah,
yes, the language
and
there would suggest that that's what was going on. We
yeah,
don't pull those things out in our argument just because, especially in the film, it's a little bit harder for people to wrap their head around. We really wanted to stick to that thesis, but you are
yeah,
100% right. And there are a lot of other examples of that that can lean more toward, yes, Jesus is an ally. Jesus was affirming, and the Bible is affirming of LGBTQ people. Quickly, Jonathan and David is another one that we don't really get into, but Jonathan said he loved David more than, no, David loved Jonathan
David.
more than any woman. And there's a scene in the Bible where, I mean, I
Hmm.
think they're getting it
Yeah,
on like pretty, you know. But then I was on a Zoom recently, and there was this person who said he had a Dutch version of the Bible. And now I'm going to be in the Netherlands this week. You better believe I'm going to be trying to find this version of the Bible because he said that in his mama's Bible, it said that Jonathan and David orgasmed. Now, who took that out, or is that really in there? I'm going to find this Dutch version of
thank
the Bible,
you.
and then we got to start looking at this because somebody took that out if that were the case.
Yes, thank you. That would be some hot evidence.
That would be hot evidence. So you better
I'd like
believe
to
I'm
read
in the
that
Netherlands.
evidence.
I'm going to be looking for the Orgasm Bible.
We've had so much damage done just because somebody decided to translate something differently, you know?
Mhm.
And it happened to me. The reason I'm an ex-pastor is because when I came out as trans, they let me go.
Mm.
And it still hurts and it still sucks. But it's nice to hear from other people that I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. Like I'm onto something. And I wish you'd listen.
Wow.
Mhm.
I'm glad. I mean, I hate that that happened to you, but the Presbyterian Church has been really good to a trans man minister. Presbyterian Seminary has been really good to the trans people I know, and I know
Okay.
one that's got a job preaching at a church right now.
Hey.
Caveat with that, you want to make sure that it's PCUSA
Yeah,
Presbyterian, not PCA Presbyterian,
right. That's the one
or
that's headquartered.
Fundamental Presbyterian Church, whatever. There's a couple different ones, but
Right.
PCUSA is the queer friendly one. I'm a pastor's kid, Midwestern Presbyterian pastor's kid. My mom did campus ministry my whole childhood. And so I grew up hearing a lot of this, but even then, because of the culture of Christianity as a whole, it doesn't really get all of the people. We have the theology, but the culture is still really touch and go.
So much of this, the knowledge that Bobbie and Rocky have shared, specifically being able to just cite Bible verses and stuff, it honestly reminds me of my mom. She loves a Bible study. She loves to dig on in, talk about the different verses, analyze little chunks at a time. So I wonder if there's anyone who has come across, obviously 1946 is a great resource, maybe not a full-length documentary, but maybe, I don't know, anything, a list of resources that talks about this, or a pamphlet that breaks down the Bible verses.
This might be a bit more of like something specific for like a Bible study, but I don't know if y'all have ever heard of the Skeptics Annotated Bible. That is super, super interesting. It's essentially the Bible, but it's been picked over by someone who is essentially like comparing certain passages to other passages, noting where things are either pro LGBTQ or just like weirdly violent. And
This one is not necessarily queer or trans specific, but a book that I read recently is called Do I Stay Christian by Brian McLaren. It talks about like it's broken up into 3 sections. Part 1 is no, I don't stay Christian, and it gives all of these reasons why. It talks about anti-Semitism, Crusader colonialism. I've got the table of contents pulled up right here. It's got some really good nuance in it, and then the part 2 is yes, I do, and like why to stay Christian. And then part 3 is how, and like how to reconcile either leaving or staying, regardless of like what you choose. How do you reconcile that from these nuanced perspectives?
For those of you who have tried bringing up some of these topics to your own personal churches or family or whatnot, have you found that something works more than others? Because, something that I think we all can relate to is feeling, that we've been ostracized or outcast or not wanting to be heard, that even if we are presenting it in a way of like, oh, you want to study the Bible? Great, let's study this, this, and this. It's, kind of fallen upon deaf ears. So I'm just curious, have there been any strategies that have worked?
I always recommend starting the conversation with, so there are 2 movies, For They Know Not What They Do and For the Bible Tells Me So, 2 other movies you could watch.
Those
Yeah.
are such good movies.
Yeah, 1946.
Yeah.
So let's say you want your parents to watch For the Bible Tells Me So, and they're not going to, know something about the film and learn a fact about the film that you find interesting and it means a lot to you, which obviously it does. And so if you come at it from a place where, hey, I learned about this and wow, that's so interesting to me. This is really important. I'd love to learn more. Would you go on this journey with me? Will you watch this with me? And most of the time your parent hopefully will say yes. Now, some parents might start watching and turn it off and say, I can't do it, whatever. But that's that was my strategy that I recommend.
Another excellent documentary that I found that I loved it because the people in it were coming to their own kind of conclusions in it. Anyways, it's called Beware of Christians. And it was really good. So it's the idea that, they figured out in the end that if they weren't raised in the culture they were, they might believe something differently. So the idea that this seemingly all pervasive culture that's very strict and straight-laced is omitting a lot of things.
We were talking about resources, and I really wanted to highlight Breaking All the Rules by Christian Smith. I actually have been to a couple of their events in Atlanta, and just a phenomenal organization that they're running. If you got a chance to see any of the work with Pride in the Pews, that was also in Atlanta, they pretty much commingled with that event. But the book itself is just dismantling toxic theology, and if there's anywhere to start for those who are just like coming on board, this is a very short read. It's not super heavy. It's easy to follow, but it does get into like the biblical side of things and also his own lived experiences and the process of getting his mother on board as well. So being an elder in the church and her perspective of, okay, how do I throw away all of these things that I've held on to for 50 plus years? Anywho, yes, they're pro-women, pro-Black, pro-decolonization, and I just love them so much. Going forward, another pastor that was affiliated with them wrote Reclamation, a queer pastor's guide to finding spiritual growth in the passages used to harm us. And last but not least, a very thick read, and it's heavier than the others, but as far as like academic writing, but the Bible with and Without Jesus. It's by Dr. Amy Jill Levine, and I actually went to one of her talks downtown. It was like an hour and a half long, but it's essentially how the Christian interpretations are reflected in Jewish text.
Lots and lots of resources. I didn't even know there were that many, so that's awesome. I can't help but notice that Christianity has been the main focal point. So if anybody also wants to talk about other practices, beliefs, you know, please go for it. One thing I was thinking is, a couple people mentioned paganism, and one thing that drew me to that is this idea of there not being a patriarchy involved, that usually like the high priestess is the person who calls most of the shots. It's very nature worship, matriarchy worship, goddess worship, which for me as a former Christian was like so refreshing. And you know, also when it comes to the idea of, yeah, Mother Earth, like giver of life, there's it's always so interesting to me that Christianity took the like made the trifecta, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and just left the women out of it. We're just like, boop, not important. It still blows my mind. It really does. And I've been meaning to actually check out the I don't know if it's called the Book of Magdalene, but
Oh,
apparently
yeah.
it is. Is that what it's called?
Yeah. The Apocrypha. So I was like, oh gosh.
I am very interested in that because that seems like I want to hear her perspective. It's wild that it was left out. But anyway, I kind of wanted to open the floor a little bit into if anyone had any other information on their belief systems, how they feel like it overlaps with what we've been discussing. And if
Well,
not, me too.
yeah, the Jewish Community Center here has a really active trans support group for both trans people and parents, and they meet there. And I've got a good trans friend in New York, Dawn Innes, that actually converted to Judaism because they accepted her so well. Used to be Dawn Innes that was an ABC sportscaster, but trans woman now. And yeah, she converted to Judaism about 2 years ago, I guess.
I guess the spiritual path that I grew up with was encompassing of pretty much every religion, and to find like the common links between all religions. So when I was growing up and reading the books, there were Bible verses, there were quotes from Islam, there were, certain Hindu philosophies, Buddhist philosophies, everything was in. And I think the point was always that, we might use different words to say the same thing, like water, agua, etc. But you're talking about the same thing. And so that's why like pulling from all the different philosophies and finding the common links between them that was a part of my upbringing. But I think the thing that was helpful for me was that the teaching was that there was no other link, or there was no other kind of middle person between you and your creator. So like however you want to refer to that, wherever your origin is, that's like a very individual relationship. And I think, what I'm hearing is that, a lot of times when we're told what to believe versus like figuring out what we believe, that's where a lot of the problem comes in. That's where the power structures come in. But I'm definitely grateful for like kind of finding my own path to my own source. And I hope for us as queer folks, we get a chance to do that, because I think many times we're told that we can't, or that we don't belong in these spaces. But I think it's actually part of our survival to be able to find our way to our source, and try and kind of like release the noise of what certain communities are telling us, maybe our communities where we grew up, the religious communities. So it sounds like a lot of folks have been pursuing that in their lives, which is great.
The whole Two-Spirit people of the indigenous Americans, they've always been highly revered, and they've had different names like oracles and shamans and medicine people, and but they were clearly identified as two-spirit people, and that's a huge group in the trans community still.
This has been a really uplifting, positive conversation, which is really great. So I don't want to lean into the trauma too much, but what inspired this conversation was sharing a clip on Trans Day of Visibility last Sunday, and the amount of hate that very sweet, simple clip got was just very overwhelming.
Mhm.
And which is what led me to make that little response video of like, there is no hate like Christian love. So as far as resiliency goes, and especially when we're in an election year, many of us are in, you know, the Midwest or in states where we don't have a huge liberal support system necessarily. What do you find helps your resiliency as far as fatigue when dealing with this?
My biggest thing has been friends, people who are with me and for me. You know, I mean, I can really count them on one hand, and maybe not all the fingers that, you know, are cool with me being trans and are in my corner, you know, but the ones that are, the ones that stick around, those are who I've been really leaning on lately.
I think to that end also is finding a way to like work within your community. Like one of the things that I did, and I was encouraged to join by my friends who are queer, was to join the local Democratic committee for my county.
Mhm.
And so there are a lot of queer people in the Democratic committee, and so sometimes, you know, when you're feeling like it's hopeless, working at the local level, because that's where the real change happens. Everybody focuses on the federal elections and they ignore like all their like county board of supervisors and their city council and all that kind of stuff, where
School board,
library board, things like that. These things that you don't think are important, but they're the ones that are making the decisions for our kids, and they're the ones that are advancing policy locally that then rolls up to the state level, that then rolls up to the federal level. So if you for me, it's about taking some sort of action to try and, you know, further the gay agenda, if you will. I know that that's kind of a jokey term, but seriously, to make sure that there are people in those positions of power and leadership who are responsive and respectful of the queer community, to counteract a lot of these naysaying voices and the hate and all of that. And, you know, getting involved at that level is going to help.
real quick. And I know Rocky's been looking into this too, the dark money behind Christian nationalism. The Heritage Foundation in Washington has been writing, there have been over 1,000 anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ bills filed in the US in the last 15 months. And the Heritage Foundation has written all of them, just about. They're boilerplate things. You just insert the name of your state and the relevant laws you want to cite. But it wasn't until this delegation for Uganda came last summer, and anyhow, I was talking to him, like, talk to these people because their law is to imprison and execute homosexuals in Uganda. And I'll be damned if the Heritage Foundation didn't write every bit of that law for Uganda. The money that's behind Christian nationalism, and they don't care crap about religion except manipulate religious people, and they are doing a scary great job at what they are doing. The theocratic fascism, Christian nationalism, that thing of manipulating religious people into believing there's this huge threat to their life coming from the gay community. And that's the two things we all have in common. This big push toward nationalism, theocratic fascism, and a big push for strong arm authoritarian leadership. And it's scary. It's scary. It really is. And you mentioned capitalism. It's like they just want to have a bunch of worker bees, and it's worth it to them to be causing all this misery. Trans people that was the other thing that you probably found out, that uh, the far right, these think tanks, um, abortion was a big issue for them, and they lost that. And then same-sex marriage, and it's almost as soon as the ink was dry, legalizing same-sex marriage, that's when the first trans bathroom bill showed up in North Carolina. And even though that was a disaster, what they learned is that the trans stuff was more of a hot button issue than abortion and same-sex marriage had ever been. And that's why we've had 1,000 bills in the last 15 months. And you're right, people are getting sick of it. It's like, why don't you take care of our highways or the foster care system or homeless people? It's like, why don't you do something that looks like public service?
Most people are tired of it. And so that we just need to be louder than them.
Oh my gosh, so much. Y'all made so many good points. Ryan, the importance of community. I cannot stress that enough. Just being around like-minded people has changed my life for the better. I'm going to give y'all a spill, so bear with me, but I'm currently serving in AmeriCorps, and this is my second term. I work with an LGBTQ nonprofit down here in Mobile, and we're in the midst of our capital campaign. So if things go as planned, by the end of the year, we'll be the first LGBTQ center in this area, like Alabama, and more specifically Southwest Alabama. I know, that's crazy.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
making history.
Piggybacking off of that, of like community as the biggest thing, I worked in student advocacy from when I was 14, right before the very first bill came out, the first bathroom bill came out, all the way until like 2022, when I started working for the university that I was doing student advocacy for. And community is the only way to get through it. Really, like, community is the only way to get through the kind of work that we have to do. It's hard, it's exhausting. Like you said, Gretchen, fighting fatigue it's hard. But community, just community.
This isn't even about humanizing people. It's just about being good people. Everyone laughs at me, but I love Bill and Ted because they just be excellent to each other. Why does it have to be so much more complicated than that?
First of all, they're throwing anything at the wall to see what will stick. So that's why we had a lot of these like super extreme bills that didn't get passed. And so they go back to the drawing board and they try to find something that people will actually want, that people will go, okay, yeah, we can pass that one. But also they're scared. This is desperation at this point, because the queer community has reached kind of a critical mass and we're not hiding the way we used to. And, we're out and we're being loud about it, and it scares them. It scares these people because they can't control us under the old laws of patriarchy and capitalism. We don't pay attention to that. Well, we pay attention to it, but we don't subscribe to that, is what I'm trying to say. So they're scared and they're trying to wrest back control, and that's what all are about. And I think we saw a lot of that also right before marriage equality passed. I think there was also a lot of kind of, anti same-sex marriage. There was a big groundswell of that right before marriage equality, was codified in the Supreme Court. And so I think that's what we're seeing too. I think what we're probably seeing is this kind of last gasp effort by the conservatives and whatnot to try and push us down. And I think that what we're going to see at the other end of this is we're finally going to get something codified into law to protect us. Yeah. But we got to go through this. We got to go through this dark night first.
All they do is throw insults at us or misrepresent our argument or call us names. And these are like prominent theologians who should be faith leaders in their community, who are calling us awful names publicly Like
Yeah.
people are tired of it, and you're right,
Yeah,
Jen,
they
on that,
really-
you know, like, and you can see right through it. It supports our argument because nobody wants to be bullied, and that doesn't get us anywhere as a society or as, you know, so we're starting to see through all that. And we're having conversations like Bobbie and I, you know, the stuff that I shared today, I learned all that stuff over the last couple of years. I didn't know any of this, like, you know, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. I still surprise myself sometimes when I say this things like, wow, I learned a lot over the last couple of years, and now I'm going to share it with people. So yeah, thanks again, Gretchen, for doing this, because this is really important.
Yeah, you're
Well,
brilliant.
well, thank you all so much. It's been an honor sharing space with you tonight.
Okay.
Yeah, safe travels.